We have our last conversation on Plato, and we are switching a little bit in style because our first two conversations were expository, as the Americans like to say. That is, we made an attempt to sketch Plato's thinking in as clear and yet accurate terms as possible. But we did not really make an attempt to be critical. And today, this is going to change. Today, I think it would be inadequate for our introduction into Plato if we did not have a critical voice. Of course, people can disagree, as always, but we are elaborating tonight a critique which goes into morality. It's very deep. We are criticizing Plato that some of his proposals, political as they are, for his perfect state, would from a 21st perspective be seen as immoral. And then of course we are asked how we deal with that. And there are a number of people among a number of scholars that deal in a variety of fashion with this critique. But let's get started. So we have first, in order to explain some of these, in my opinion, mistakes that Plato makes, we have to get a hold on what he meant by soul. Now, Plato distinguished a number of souls that are connected to planets, souls like the world soul that animates the entire cosmos. He had individual souls. We're going to have a look at that. Why? We need to have a notion of soul with Plato because he takes the individual soul as a blueprint, an analog to project a structure of the state. And that's a very unusual move. I haven't seen it in that fashion, and we have to say certain things about that. But that's why we study the soul. And then we, when we have the soul, we really see how he came about having that model and what kind of conclusion he was able to draw from this model for his perfect state. So we will end up, as I said, with realizing that there is a great deal of ethnocentricity in Plato, as it is with all of us, and we try to locate some of these ethnocentricity. So now the first task, I think, I have is to define soul. Now this is an immense task because Plato wrote abundantly about soul, and there are distinctively two periods in his life, and a relatively earlier period when he was politically thinking in his Republic, apology, civil disobedience, and all of these values of social life, and then a later period that towards the end of his life, which is deposited in the dialogues like the Sophists, the Laws, Phaedrus. In this later period, he was more interested in actually just what the soul was in itself, without having any thoughts why and how that would operate in a society. And since we are having to look at how Plato did with societal models, we need also to have that look at his cosmic soul. So first of all, what is the soul? The first answer for Plato, the first answer we have to give, that the soul is not a thing. And I know, first of all, in contemporary discourse, soul you find probably only mentioned in religious discourses. Otherwise, I don't hear people talking a lot about soul. Sometimes music soul music and so on. But in general, soul for many people is something they cannot really relate to. Why? Because they're tempted to think of it as a thing. And it is not a thing. Because what would that thing be like? It reminds me of a Russian surgeon, turn of the century, who said he had opened many crania, he had operated on many people, he had never seen a soul. And the attempt of locating soul in some sense as a mental substance, spiritual substance, they all fail. Why? Because we need spatio-temporal words to characterize it. So that's the first remark. The soul is not a thing. Number two, well, what is it then, if it's not a thing? Well, the soul is a principle of life. It's a really profound definition by Plato. It goes through all of his definitions of souls. Soul is a principle of life. And the life that the soul bestows is actually demonstrable according to Plato. So how does it show that the soul is the principle of life? It shows itself that the soul can move itself. That's a distinguishing mark that shows its effect. The human body is able to move by itself, not pushed by any outside force. Of course, the human body as an empirical object is pushed in all ways, its physical laws and all that we now talk about. But for Plato, the big enigma was that there was a body, or certain bodies, that could move themselves. And of course, he thought of the world soul, and he thought of individual souls. He thought of souls that grow and decay like plants. He thought of souls that move like the animal world. The principle of self-movement was all important because lifeless objects, they are pushed around but they don't move themselves. So the question now becomes, in all that self-movement, what exactly is that self-movement? The principle of life. It is a level of life that is assigned to particular bodies. They can be celestial bodies, like planets. Every planet has a soul. The celestial bodies, also stars, have souls. These souls are located their place in the universe by gods, usually, because behind every soul there is also the God that often manages the soul. There is a circulation of souls. At the end of the Republic, for instance, Plato mentions that souls are circulating, almost like we now talk about a circular economy. It's very interesting that for Plato, the amount of souls remains pretty constant, but there is a circulatory movement in there insofar as their assignment to particular bodies is very enigmatic, because at least at the end of the Republic, he has a legend which he puts in Socrates' mouth, according to which the choice of what kind of body you would like to move, so to speak, in the sense of creating an organismic and organic unity, that choice is a very interesting mixture between fate, your past experiences with different bodies, and also freedom, that you are actually having a say in which kind of body, in this circulation of bodies, you would like to apply to yourself. And so the options are endless. You could choose sort of a worldwide cosmic dimension. You could choose any kind of animal. Plato lists a few, but there is a moral allegory in this proposal, in this circulation of souls, and this is that the soul is taking relationships with bodies in order to become better. So the good, really, the form of the good that we talked about, informs these souls to be good souls, because the soul per se has no morality. I mean, it's not, there are good souls, there are bad souls. The soul is somehow taken away from the criteria that would make it good or bad. These criteria come from elsewhere, not from the soul. The soul is open, but there are all sorts of, how should I say, the enemies of souls that are also souls, obviously. And there are all sorts of resistances in the universe at large, but also on the individual soul, in every individual human being. There are lots of conflicts. On the cosmic level, what the soul's fears most is chaos, that there is no order all of a sudden. And the demiurge, which is a sort of a god that creates the world soul, he's worried about these dark elements in the cosmos that try to overrun the principle of these eternal movements of the stars and the planets. On the individual level, obviously, the big obstacle that souls face is whether they want to really, again, be informed by the good, or whether they have become evil by making the wrong choices. We'll get to know that a little bit when we talk about the individual soul. So that's more or less the issue with souls. Now, Plato, when he thinks of creating the best state, which is an aristocracy, where the ariston means the best in Greek. And so he wants the best people involved. He thinks not very highly of democracy, because democracy really are a bunch of people, undifferentiated, low education, etc. He fears them really very, very, very hard. Or there are people he sees, there are the Democrats, T-I-M-E, so they are interested in honors, they're interested in making a name for themselves. Many of these souls are, they are inferior for Plato's choice. So he creates an aristocracy, but what is so fascinating that when he goes about creating that ideal state, the republic, he doesn't take the model of the spheres so much, the model where the circulation, the in and out of souls, etc. He could have created some fantastic programs with showing how the moral ascent of some souls, or the descent of souls into evil, etc., could have helped for him to sort out a model for the perfect state that he would have been advocated, like we talked about last time in the Philebus, that follows the forms of the good. No, he didn't do that. What he did was, he chose the human individual as a model to then project from that human individual, project an institutional model that baffles, to some extent, everybody. And we are now going into discussing this switch from individual soul. We will be talking about what it consists of, and then show how he projected that political order from it. So I make a little pause just to ask you whether you have questions about the soul in Plato, as I have sketched it. First of all, he takes as a picture element the human anatomy. You have to imagine a person, male or female, because they are equal on all levels. So you have to imagine a person, and what do you find on top? You find on top the brain, all right, the head. So the head is sort of the local, place of control of the entire body. And so that pretty much agrees with what we would think about nowadays, about the function of the brain and the laws and capabilities that we are having. So the brain gives him a control center right off the human figure. And what it means is he calls it logiston, it's the structure of the brain is basically logic, but it also is in control of lower levels of the soul. And the next lower level, as you go down the picture of the human person, is the heart for him. Now you would think that he would think of love or something. No, not a way. That's not Plato's thought. No. The heart for him is the symbol of courage. It's a symbol of endurance, the symbol of stamina, as you would say. That is the second level right off the human body. He has an interesting story, Plato, and it relates to war. He has Leontius, a character, going to the front of the war, and on the way to the war zone, he sees these corpses lying around. And of course, he shies away immediately, totally shocked. And instantly, he thinks, that's not for me. I'm not going forward, etc. And he's tempted to go back. And then that particular element that Plato calls the heart, the courage, he makes up his mind and says, no, I'm overcoming my inner conflict. I'm going forward. So this victory over his own tendencies that are in conflict with each other, they create a level of themselves. It's called thumos, normally translated as mood, but it's much more profound than mood. It is really an act of willpower over what would draw you away from what you need to do, and that is to go forward in the battle. As you go further down, so far we have two levels of the psychology. We have the control level, and the second we have the kind of courage level, and the third level that sort of goes down into the belly, the sexual organs and the feet. They symbolize for in human terms, the level which is a ground level. It's really necessary for the human person to move. He's moved by the soul, obviously, but should I say this dimension, the third dimension is really the ground, the empirical ground, characterized by needs, sexual drives, by goals like money and so on. Now, so on the one hand, now you have the picture of the so-called three parts of the soul, and now he takes it upon himself to create a second column next to it, parallel to that first one. And he sort of reads off now questions like, now what in a perfect state would be a control level? How would it look like? Or how would it look like if the courage level, this endurance level, how would that look like institutionally in a state? And thirdly, the sort of basic recreational level and nourishment, and sex, money, and all of that. How would that look in the lineup of the perfect state? So it is very important that you see this transfer of a human person, a human soul, to the institutional order. So we have now to explore what that control center is institutionally. Now keep in mind, he wants to present the perfect state. It's a very ambitious enterprise because the polis is an permanent decay. It's impermanent. It only lasts a few years, then you have another government. The instability of the Greek governments of Athens was extraordinary. So that Plato philosophizing in terms of Socratic dialogue, he puts into Socrates these attempt to create a perfect state. By perfect, he means a stable government, a stable that would last and provide security. And his answer to the stability of that government would be justice. The principle of justice would create the perfect state. So, what does he do now? Who is controlling in that perfect state? It is the so-called guardians. These are rulers. They are carefully selected, self-selected. They have, and here comes a number of proposals that are really shocking when you read them for the first time. For instance, the rulers have no private property. Because why? It would deflect them, distract them from the only duty they really have, and that is to worry and work for the common good. So they have no private property. They have also no families. Because again, family matters, as you and I know very well, can be overwhelming, and they belong for Plato to the private sector, nothing to do. So he wants his rulers, these guardians, he wants them free of family obligations. Number three, these rulers on occasional dates are allowed to have sex, and of course they need to have sex with the best people among the rulers, and so that's a process that is controlled and brings about a situation when the ruler doesn't know who his children are, nor does he really know anything else about that order. And so these proposals were shocking even at Plato's time, and he continued the level below, the level of courage. That institutionally would be the military, and they're called auxiliaries, an enormously important component of the perfect state, because obviously the material, physical security was very important precisely in Athens. As you come down to the bottom level, these primary needs that are make up the state, also for food, planting, farming, artisans, that level of the institution would be practically untouched, in the sense that they could have families, they could have accumulating money, they could do all the business, they could own slaves, they were enslaved by themselves, by some of the rulers. So these third level citizens really provided the material infrastructure for the mental outlook of the rulers. The mental outlook was to create a state and work towards a perfect state in justice, etc. So let us just step back for a moment and think what has happened here. Out of a living organism, of a human person, there rarely, I would say, a human person thinks of having three parts in their body. I don't know, maybe sometimes we think of our upper and lower parts, but this is an organism. It's a living organism where everything is interconnected with everything else. And all of a sudden, in this transfer to the institutional order, we find three classes of people. These classes are very rigid. In other words, if you are belonging to one of the classes, you're there forever practically. There are very rare exceptions when one individual or so is judged, yeah, he can move up a level into the next class. So that's the first kind of critique I would launch toward Plato, that he has created a system that looks good on paper, but it's totally fraught with sort of mistakes of creating a caste system, and this in a state that was focusing on justice, and that this case system was had every good intention, obviously, to work for the good, but it was too static. It was, you cannot create institutions out of organisms, you know. And even modern attempt, as you may have noted, to call corporations persons or corporations with a heart, it never works, because the corporation, they are a sort of static principle, they are institutions, etc. And so that is something that has startled scholars for a long time. Now, as you look into these classes, what you also notice is that they are not organically created. They are created by the rulers. They decide who is going to what level. And so it's a state controlled, again, for the betterment of the state in Plato, because the only thing he really is worried about is the stability of the system, the stability of the state. And he's willing to do certain, to make certain concessions to bring these, to bring this stability, make it real. So I'm stopping again, trying to figure out whether what I said so far was understandable, and whether you have maybe a question about any of this.
What came to mind when you criticize Plato is that what I read in current literature about democracy is resonating well with what Plato said. You see, you find many references to Plato these days with respect to what is the more efficient and effective system. Is it a democracy where everybody has to make his word or vote or whatever? Or is it what the German term Geistesaristokratie, following Nietzsche in the early 20th century, brought about? And that is to say, there needs to be a kind of differentiation, maybe not in three classes or castes, but there needs to be a certain limit to what the ordinary people can do. What would you say with respect to this kind of proposition?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable. It sounds reasonable. Some principle has to be found, especially in the context, modern context, where we realize to what horrible situations democracies can lead. You know, the danger of tyrannies, for Plato, the danger of oligarchy, etc., and all of that. The danger of democracy, they were all present in his mind when he decided to provide a certain stability. But what I mean is that for a modern perspective, these elements or groups of people that he has also as an institution, on the level of an institution, they seem to be very close to racism, because they really have no say and no access to these other levels. And I think what is lacking in this case system of Plato, some modern scholars complain, that there is no organic unity between those three levels. So I'll show you how some of the, how should I say, now the proposals, concrete proposals that Plato makes goes sort of over the edge. Any kind of government needs a variety of institutions that are checking other parts of the institution. If you think of a constitution like the US Constitution, that looks all very, very good. And you know, you have a jury, you have an executive, you have a legislative, all of that. You have also in the social contract, you have obviously people, especially in sort of a newer version of the social contract, that are in control of government, and the individuals you often mention as tacitly sort of obeying those rules. But again, in our contemporary discussion with what happens now with the Bundesländer and with the federal government, the Bundes government in Germany, you will see how these pressures sort of are in tension with each other. It's fascinating, I think. And to that extent, I think it's totally understandable that Plato created three levels, and you can see as a sort of in a how should I say, in a relatively vague fashion, that these different institutions need to be in place to provide improvement, critique, and even stability. Now, the first proposal I want to single out that Plato proposes is that among those rulers that have the best sex, they are having sex with the best rulers, and there is, as regards their progeny, their children, they don't know obviously who their children are, but what they all agree on is if that child is not perfect, if that child shows deformity, has only one arm, or if that child turns out to be not, during those long years of study, at the beginning realizing this is not for us, the child is discarded. And the child is discarded, killed, in other words, in a most drastic way, in a variety of ways. It was set outside the city walls, where it often had a very cruel death. Or Plato mentions, among other things also, that they are taken away and put in a secret place, not mentioning what would happen on that secret place to these children, but you never hear of them again. At the same time, the children that the lower classes produce, let's say the farmers, the artisans, and all of that, again, these children, in order to have a solid amount of regular citizenship, they are also discarded. Now, it is a fact that this kind of infanticide, this kind of killing unwanted children was rampant in that area. I didn't see any kind of state that didn't do it. That is not my problem. My problem is that from the 21st century, that I would call immoral. That you would have a machinery where the life of an infant would be worth not only nothing, but the way it is killed is of a cruelty that is hardly imaginable. So that's the first. It has always been a shock to me. If you think of Aristotle for a short time, Aristotle not only wanted to affirm the practice of infanticide, he created a law. He proposed a law that it's now being obligatory to get rid of deformed children. And it has always bothered me as I studied the wisdom of the ancients. Think of this wonderful example Aristotle gives about virtue ethics in his Nicomachean Ethics. It's studied forever. It's a wonderful piece of ethics, and yet it's the same person who proposes these, what again for 21st century are totally immoral proposals. Or Plato, for instance, who advocated in a beautiful way what civil disobedience really was all about. I think he got it completely right in his figure of Socrates. But the same person then had absolutely no regard to life. And so that is a bundle of questions. I want to hear you out a little bit after I add a few other elements in his filling in the dots of the perfect institution. The second element I want to single out is lying. There are at least two examples in the Republic where the rulers lie in order to achieve political stability. And it's in the scholarship, it's called the noble lie. Yeah, well, you know, noble. What is noble about lying? We are living in a time where lying on the political level becomes an all-pervasive habit. So there's nothing noble about it, in my opinion. But what happens? Okay, so in order for these three elements to be relatively stable and not think, why are we farmers? Why can't we be rulers, etc.? There has to be a move made by the rulers that show that these kind of conventional distinctions of who belongs to what class are really natural. That's a process called naturalization. It's rampant again. If you think of, for instance, as an example, the gender discussion, whether what is feminine, what is male, etc. These discussions that are constructed, the sexes are constructed, the gender roles are constructed by societal factors. There are attempts to making them appear natural. And say, well, by nature, women are such and such, and by nature, men are such and such. And these are incredible category mistakes. Well, exactly the same exists now on the level of lying. There is this lie that when the earth was collaborating with the gods to produce the perfect state and the souls that would belong in, that the earth was coming forth with souls that were golden souls. You easily recognize in these golden souls the rulers. But then there were also souls that were made of silver by the earth, and they were obviously the military. And as you go lower, you have lower metal worth. You have bronze, and you have iron to characterize those elements. So the populace in the Republic was kind of satisfied that this was not just an arbitrary. No, it was really destiny. It was objective that they would belong to that class, and it contributed highly to the stability of the state in this proposal of the Republic. So now, the other thing of lying happens on the level of the guardians, the rulers. And there, the issue is the following, all right? The special committee of those rulers wants to make sure that the best rulers have sex with the best rulers. And so they're worried about that some other elements would intrude themselves that would make it impossible. So what did they do? They invented a lottery system where each of the rulers would pick a lot and then be assigned one of those wonderful best partners. And it was perfectly satisfied. Jealousy was eliminated, again in the interest of stability. But with one mistake, the lottery was rigged. Completely rigged, because they didn't trust the selection of the rulers. The special committee made, in order to make sure, had to lie to the rulers that there was an so-called objective system at work, but there wasn't. It was again an invention of the state to keep the rulers in order. And it's astounding to me how on this highest level, I mean, if you read about how these rulers are prepared for their job, it's totally astounding, this educational system. And you wonder, I mean, that must be practically semi-gods. They became philosophers, they became wise people. You wonder why these rulers would still suffer from jealousies that the Central Committee had to take care of. So that's a thing that baffles me too. But lying in order for the political goals to achieve, that is a principle, I think, that I would identify as immoral on principle, and not everybody would agree, obviously. We can discuss that in a moment, but it's really something that deforms the entire system. You can call it noble or not. The means that you are using are the wrong means to achieve the stability. And now a third element of startling, I would say, mistake, but maybe not of a moral nature so much, but of the really alarming shortcoming of the state planning, and it has to do with censorship. There's an enormous amount of censorship in that proposed state of Socrates. And the number one censorship obviously belongs to arts and to the poets. So the poets are completely eliminated. You can imagine what a state would look like by eliminating those arts. And why this attack on the poets? And why should they be eliminated? Especially since Plato himself, when he tries to put reasonings into Socrates' mouth, he uses poetic language, he uses analogies, he uses mythologies, he uses allegories, he uses all sorts of poetic devices in order to get his point across. Yet the poets in Book 10 of the Republic, no place in this perfect state, no place the arts either, when you think of these dramatic arts and the sculpture that keep the attention of people back on the level of appearance and not on the level where they should be. So this is really kind of a contradiction. We saw that with lying. Remember us, the good life was including truth, and yet when the proposal takes on form, lying all of a sudden becomes permissible. Here we have enormous amounts of demonstration of true poetic artistry in the entirety of Plato's corpus. And while he's using it fully and very effectively, he doesn't want the poets in his thing. Why not? Because they never go beyond the level of appearance. They deal with emotions, and because they deal with emotions, it calls them back to a level that doesn't belong to bringing about stability in the state. They are a disturbing element, the arts. So I want to stop here so that we have time for discussions about your reaction to to this critique that I'm launching here. I'll give you some scholarly reactions so that I have something to compare with. Some people think, now listen, these are things, we are 2,500 years away from them. They did that, it was practically natural for them to do that. They didn't think twice. They thought that what they were doing was right. And so it raises issues whether we in the 21st century have the right to go back and say, hey, listen, what you were doing was really, what you were proposing, that's really immoral. The question come up like, is that immoral only for our modern perspective? Or was it immoral why they were doing it? They obviously didn't know about it. It's what I call ethnocentrism. You know, each of us, everybody, grows up with internalization of the culture in which they live. Now, the question I have for you, can we blame people to act on habits of thoughts that they have internalized unconsciously, practically, since early childhood?
I don't think, again, it's a matter of criticizing them for the limits of their world, because, of course, it was pretty clear in Athens that slaves were not considered to be human beings in the sense they talked about the citizens of Athens that were entitled to vote and to participate in public life. And if you look at history, of course, it goes all along, even to the American Constitution, you see.
Yeah.
People talking about human rights and nevertheless not thinking about slaves as humans. So it's really interesting to learn more about how they conceived of a human being. And, well, you started out by talking to us about the body, the soul, and the heart. And it's interesting, I think, to learn more from you about what you think, how this anthropological assumption impacted on the perfect state as the example, or the, let's say, the transformation of the human constant, or the human constituencies.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question again, and it's pretty close to my heart, how to react to them. Yeah, as you know, Karl Popper, last century, he saw in Plato a kind of a roadmap to totalitarianism. Now, in his book, Open Society, he was really, his target of the critique was fascism and the birth of fascism. It's a very, in my opinion, incomplete book, and also shows quite a few mistakes, but it shows how in our learning about these ingrained principles that we just take for granted, we never thought about it because we haven't even identified it. How that can be selected as a ground for, you know, your own program. It is during the Second World War in Germany. There was a guy called Hans Günther. He wrote a book towards the Weimar Republic, or a little bit later too, again, 1935, with the title Plato, Platon, der Vater, der Hüter des Lebens, heißt the title. Der Hüter des Lebens. So you can pick out some of these things in a variety of ways, and my question is, the critique that I have in mind when it raises questions about how we think about ethics arises by comparing the value system of that time with the value systems of our current time.
Yeah.
And it raises issues whether we have a right, based on our insights and our moral sensibilities, to criticize from our perspective and condemn those practices as immoral. It seems to me, if we do that, we accept an objective ethical canon, and not a relativistic one. Now, I personally am an objective ethicist. I believe in an objective ethics. And so, for me, when it comes to assessing what certain people did, unbeknownst to them, from my perspective, they did something wrong. And I wanted to, that can be, this attitude can be criticized, but if Aristotle called women monsters because they were not quite human, you see that all the time. In the American Constitution, the slaves were not truly human beings. And yet, I say, in the 21st century, after Lincoln and after that, that was wrong. You see what I mean? I mean, the crazy thing is that in their own mind, they didn't do anything wrong. It was part of their, how should I say, ingrained principles. But believing in universal ethics, I condemn practices that they didn't know about. I condemn them from my point of view in the 21st century. So I hope I haven't led you too far astray with these things. But I'm wondering...
the value systems of their time, who has determined those? Where do they come from?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for instance, as infanticide, the killing of animals, it was practiced everywhere in that area. No questions. Nobody had any objections. From Egypt to India to the whole realm that we are talking about, Greece, Thracia, North, it was all taken for granted.
But why are they lying?
Yeah, they are lying. That's an excellent question. They are lying because they do it for a higher cause, and this is why they call their lies noble. But what is the higher cause? The perfect state is the state that is here to last, stability. So they're lying to prevent unstable elements to take control. Do the means justify the end? I don't think they gave at least in Socrates, as he proposes these noble lies, the myth of the four metals, the golden people and the iron people, bronze people, silver people. I don't think that these lies were considered harmful by the creator of the state, by the rulers, because they served they served, in their opinion, a good end. But look at it more closely again. You know, it sort of, for me, triggers discussions that you can find in Immanuel Kant, this sort of popular thing that you should never lie, and all the popular stories that are associated with this. You can really zoom in on that. For instance, when Kant says you should never lie, he thinks of the court system. Of course, he would agree, in my opinion, in terms of context, that when somebody knocks at your door and says, I hear your mother, is a traitor, where is she? Oh, yeah, she's right there in that closet, etc. So these are sort of, how should I say, kind of popular mistakes in thinking about lying. And when you lie for what, in your opinion, is a noble cause, the question is, again, in my opinion, whose noble cause is it? Just think of it about last time we were talking about The Good Life in Philebus. It's the same author. And truth is part of the good life. The same author who writes the Republic, all of a sudden, you can lie, you know. So I leave you with that. I mean, I'm condemning lying. I mean, it is like lying, it's like a poison that pervades the whole system.
Yeah, but it lives on, doesn't it? With white lies in English, or in German, Notlügen, so you can have all kinds of justifications for that, without, of course, justifying it at the normative level. I think that's the crazy thing about it.
I think you're right, yeah. I mean, the context reveals there are thousands of contexts in which the only accurate reaction is to lie. And so it all depends whether you want to institutionalize this. But it raises questions. I still have questions about that. You know, I'm just of. I haven't managed clarity on that. Is it because the issue is so conflicted, so internally leading to possible abuse once you have adopted it?
Well, thank you once again for a wonderful evening, Eugen, and I look forward to next week's exposition on Nietzsche, which of course is quite a jump in history or philosophy, but it will be probably wonderful, because there is this notion of we have to have a kind of aristocracy that is actually the Geistesaristokratie, if you like, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's going to be really revealing. And right at the start, we will see that how one becomes what one is uttered by a philosopher who doesn't believe in the subject. It's a fiction. So be prepared to go into some very exciting territory there. And I have to tell you again how much I enjoy these conversations, because I just enjoy talking about these things, although the clarity that we achieve in those conversations is often leading to much more important other questions. And, and so I leave those other questions to you and for your bedtime stories. Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, thank